3.3 Stress, Anxiety and Arousal. So, starting with scenario 1, Nick shows signs of being overstressed, distressed. Perhaps this is from being number 2 seed in his college and feeling like he needs to perform well. So when stressed, the sympathetic nervous system sends impulses to the body's systems in order to prepare the body to deal with stress. This is also known as the fight or flight response. The sympathetic nervous system speeds up the heart rate and breathing rate in order to get more oxygen to the muscles to either run or fight. This is, instincts. It's innate response. In the context of sport, the response is to prepare an athlete for the coming physical activity. If perceived in a positive way, like a challenge, these physiological changes can increase the performance and can help to reach eustress. This is the ability to cope with stress and pressure of a situation by perceiving the situation positively and believing the stress will help them win. So I think I've got a graph here. I can change the slide. Yeah, here. So eustress, we can see, brings about the highest level of performance on this graph. However, when the physiological responses are perceived as being negative, they can cause distress, which decreases performance levels as shown on the graph. And this is known as the stress process, McGrath in 1970. So Nick seems to be perceiving his naturally built up stress as negative, which would explain why in games he can't play the more accurate shot as he is distressed. So when I say natural stress, it's because it's the fight or flight response that we just said. He can't play the more accurate shot because he has become distressed and overstressed as he is perceiving it in a negative way. Arousal is general physiological and psychological activation varying on a continuum from deep sleep to intense excitement. Weinberg and Gould, 2007. It's also described as the readiness to perform. The inverted U theory of arousal could be used to explain Nick's situation, as shown on this graph here. The middle of the graph with medium levels of arousal would suggest that this is where the optimal level of arousal is for performance. This optimal level of performance can change varying on the type of activity. So for example, an activity that requires lower levels of arousal, such as archery, the best performance level would be lower, further left on the graph, whereas a sport that requires a higher level of arousal, maybe perhaps rugby or football or sort of game sports, might be a bit higher, boxing, and so therefore the optimum level would be to the right. So this differs between athletes. So for Nick, in the scenario, it would suggest that he has passed his optimal level of arousal. As it states, he is becoming nauseous and feeling ill before games, which is a sign of being over aroused. So his levels have become too high that his performance level decreases. So his optimum level of arousal, he has passed it, and he is slowly, gradually decreasing on the graph, as the inverted U theory would suggest. Nidfer 1970 suggested that increased levels of arousal has an effect on the attention field of a performer. He found high levels of arousal narrows the athlete's attention field, meaning they are unable to take in external factors and may react to the wrong cue, therefore giving strong evidence for higher levels of arousal can decrease performance levels. So again, we can link this back to Nick and say that because he has a higher levels of arousal, or we seem to think he does. He is therefore his performance is decreased as his attention field has been lowered. As also the inverted U theory would suggest that low levels of performance of arousal cause low levels of performance. However, inverted U theory suggests that we gradually get worse with more arousal. This does not completely account for Nick, as he seems to fall apart, in quotations, fully during games, as it said in the scenario. There is no gradual decrease in the performance with Nick, and therefore the inverted U theory may not be accurate in terms of describing his performance. Catastrophe theory takes this into account and is better suited to explain Nick's situation. Vasey and Hardy in 1988 came up with this theory. This is the graph on the right here. Similar to the inverted U theory, in the first half of the graph, performance increases gradually, but once they pass their optimum arousal, they reach a point where a dramatic decline occurs, known as the catastrophe point within the performance. This would explain why Nick's performance completely falls apart at a certain point during a game, as he is over-aroused, causing his performance to completely drop and fall apart. Research shows that this relationship is valid. However, testing and predicting the performance is difficult, meaning that we can't be 100% sure that this is what's causing Nick's bad performance. So this catastrophe theory, it's hard to predict performance, and meaning it can't be 100% accurate. As well as this, Nick may also be suffering from trait anxiety, Buckworth and Dishman in 2002. This theory suggests that a person is in constant state of worry in all situations. It's a built-in process that is innate and causes a negative emotional state with increased levels of arousal, which, as described before, can decrease the performance. Nick's trait anxiety can cause him to overreact to situations and become more anxious about his performance to come, increasing his arousal and therefore making him less able to play the more accurate shots during a game, as said in the example. So moving on to scenario 2. In scenario 2, the goal shooter for the netball team, Sarah, shows signs of state anxiety. Anxiety itself is defined as a negative state of worry or apprehension or tension that often occurs in the absence of real or oblivious danger. Buckworth and Dishman, 2002. State anxiety refers to the right now feelings that change from moment to moment. It's the emotional response to any situation considered to be threatening. Cognitive anxiety triggers the physiological somatic anxiety responses. This can be used to explain Sarah's performance in different games. In normal games, she performs well with an 86% accuracy, whereas during big games against Bardeen and Lewis, that are often rival games, her performance drops to 32%. This shows that her performance dip is temporary and therefore could be a result of a temporary state anxiety, as it is described. When in games against Bardeen and Lewis, Sarah has negative cognitive expectations about her ability to perform well in these games, and may fear embarrassment from spectators or opposition players. These cognitive thoughts and perceptions can trigger her somatic anxiety. This is the physical component of anxiety associated with increased heart rate and blood pressure. These are the same symptoms of arousal, but they are triggered by cognitive anxiety. If these physiological changes are perceived as negative, then she will experience muscle tension, clammy hands, and a queasy stomach, all of which can lead to her attention being pulled away from the game which ultimately decreases Sarah's level of performance as she is focusing on her clammy hands, her queasy stomach, and her muscle tension, and not the game, because she has perceived the initial responses, being the heart rate and the blood pressure, as negative. Sarah's cognitive anxiety increases leading up to big games against Vandine and Lewis, while her somatic anxiety remains low until a dramatic rise before the event. In terms of arousal, Sarah's performance issue may be explained using the Izov model, handed in 1986. And it's this image here. There's one else. This theory suggests that athletes have their own specific zone at which they are at peak performance, depending on their level of state anxiety, and in 1986. Sarah could be described as having a low Izov zone, similar to athlete A in the image. This meaning she plays her best at a low level of arousal and anxiety. This would explain why in big games against rivals with a higher level of arousal, she does not perform as well. However, her teammate Rachel would be the opposite and more like athlete C, as she seems to play better in games with a higher level of arousal. Izov theory does not specify why better performances are more likely in an optimal zone, but it's more of an observation of the differences. Therefore, there is no answer to what causes these differences from this theory. However, the research generally supports the theory, and therefore it's accepted that people have different zones in which they perform best. Zones at different levels of anxiety and arousal. In order for Sarah to perform better in her important rival netball games, she might consider some somatic and cognitive techniques to try and reduce her anxiety. She could try using breathing control as a somatic technique, using diaphragmatic breathing to help focus on relaxation. This can also help for her to perceive the physiological changes her breathing rate that she is now controlling in a more positive light. Therefore, her state anxiety can be reduced and she can perceive these changes positively. Imagery creates the feeling of being successful in an attempt to reduce cognitive anxiety and cancelling out any negative misconceptions. So this would also be an effective way for Sarah to decrease her cognitive anxiety. If Sarah uses both these cognitive and somatic techniques, she can reduce her state anxiety and arousal levels to a point where she is in her optimal zone to perform at her best. As mentioned before, Sarah's teammate Rachel has no problem with playing under pressure. Another reason for their differences may be their different positions in netball. Sarah's position as goal shooter requires a level of focus associated with low arousal environments as she is shooting, whereas Rachel does not shoot and her role as center requires larger motor movement and more simple movement, typically associated with higher levels of arousal. Therefore, the higher arousal rival games suit Rachel better than Sarah, therefore explaining why Rachel seems to play better in these games, as the level of arousal is much higher in these games, so it suits her game and her position, whereas Sarah may struggle a bit more as she may lose her technique perhaps in these situations. And what I've just described there is well demonstrated on the inverted U theory, suggesting that they have different optimal levels, as I've also described before. So Sarah would be the red line on this graph, and Rachel would be the blue line. So this is part 1 of 3.3. Thanks for watching.